it means that the object that is very, very small. Like, for example, even among microorganisms, there are there are complex microorganisms and there are simple microorganisms. When we say simple microorganisms, it means that there are microorganisms that you can see them with a simple microscope, like light microscope. But when we said complex microorganisms, it's like virus, prions, they are very complex and you cannot see them with the normal you cannot see them with the with normal light microscope until when you use an electrical microscope. So electrical microscope is actually a high resolution and a high magnification machine that can be used to visualize its very, very tiny object. So using this electron microscope, it was able to, by the scientists to discover that the cell is having a triple layered structure. Triple layered structure. It has a triple layered structure. And the thickness of those layers is between 7.5 to 10 nanometers. That is the thick of these layers. So it means that how does it look? Usually the cell membranes look like something like this. It looks like something like this. There is the first layer and this is also another layer. And there is also another layer here. We are going to look at the structure very closely as we have the structure here. So it looks like something like this. The cell membrane looked like this. So using this electron microscope, we were able, or scientists are able to actually find out that the cell is made of these three layers. And of course, this is the thickness of the layer. So the term coined by Daniel Lee and Grammer in 1855 and plasma lemma coined by JQ Leo in 1931. So it means that the term cell membrane, the name cell membrane was coined by Nageli and Grammer. So these are the two scientists that was able to coin the name of the cell membrane. And of course, for the plasma lemma, I remember I told you the other name for the cell membrane is also plasma lemma. So it's actually coined by Lowe in 1931. So all the scientists, you have to actually get them and jot them. So please, as we are having this class, try as much as possible to be jotting all what we are discussing, because it's very, very important. Because I remember in this course, so many of these questions, you may see them in question paper. So please get the concept very clear. So this is just actually some basic introduction in relation to the cell membrane. Number one, the cell membrane has three names. You can call it either plasma membrane, plasma lemma, and it separates inside or the interior of a cell from the outside of the cells. And using electron microscope, scientists was able to visualize this electron microscope to appear to have triple layered, and the thickness is between 7.5 to 10 nanometer. Okay, so now the next thing that we are going to look at is actually how the cells look like. So the cell membrane is flexible and it allows a unicellular organisms to move. So it is very flexible. It is flexible and it allows some of the unicellular organism to move in and out. Okay. And then the next thing now we are going to look at is the composition, the chemical composition of cell membrane. What made this cell membrane? So the chemical composition of this cell membrane, the membrane is made up of number one. In the cell membrane, we have lipids. And what is this lipids? So four major classes of lipid are commonly found in the plasma membrane. There are four major types of lipids that are found in the plasma membrane. So number one, we have phospholipids. We have phospholipid. So phospholipid is found in the cell membrane. And what is phospholipid? Phospholipid, it means it's a lipid that have phosphate attached to it, and is the most abundant. It has the highest percentage. It means that in this lipid, in the case of phospholipid, it has phosphate group attached to it, and that is why it is called phosphate group. But ladies and gentlemen, I think you need to understand what is the lipid itself because it's important. Let me just say something brief on lipids. So I think from the concept lipid is made of two major components. Lipid is made of two major components, and this component of the lipid, number one, we have what we call fatty acids. We have fatty acids. We have fatty acids, and then we have glycerol. Glycerol. So fatty acid and glycerol is what actually form these lipids. So if you say that we have phospholipid, it means that in the case of phospholipid, there is a phosphate attached to the glycerol. And that is why it is called phospholipids. And another type of lipid that also found in the cell membrane, there is also sphingolipids. Sphingolipids. So it means that in the lipid, there is a sphingosine attached to it. That is why it's called sphingolipid. There is a sugar attached to it, and the name of the sugar is called sphingosine. That is the name of the sugar. It's called sphingosine. It's called sphingosine. And then we have glycolipids. Glyco means sugar. It means sugar. Sugar means carbohydrate. So glycolipid, it means that there are sugars that have, there are lipids that have sugars attached to it. And there is also steroid lipids. So these are the four major lipids that are found in the cell membrane, and the one that have the highest percentage and the most abundant is phospholipids. So you need to get this. So these are the major lipids that are found in the cell membrane. And then the next thing is proteins. Apart from lipids, there are proteins. So plasma membrane contains about 50% proteins. So 50% of the plasma membrane are proteins. Amount and the type is varied. So the amount of the lipid and the types of the lipid that are found in this cell membrane varies from one another. Like for example, in the myelin cells, it contains about 25% integral protein of chloroplast and mitochondria. And mitochondria contain 50% proteins. So what are these types of proteins that usually found in the cell membrane? They are, number one, we have what we call integral protein and peripheral protein. So when you say integral protein, what is integral proteins? Integral proteins are those proteins that that are fully embedded into the cell membrane. Like for example, if you have something like this, let's say this is your cell membrane. So if you have this as your cell membrane, something like this. If you have this as your cell membrane, something like this. So when you have the proteins that fully like this is a protein, but if you look at it, it's fully embedded into this cell membrane. So this type of protein is called integral protein. It's called integral protein. So they are the proteins that are fully embedded into a cell membrane. But when you have the proteins that are transiently or partially attached to this cell membrane, so these types of proteins, they are called peripheral protein. Peripheral protein. We call them peripheral proteins. So these are the types of protein that are partially attached to the membrane of the cell. And those proteins that are fully engaged and embedded into the cell membrane, they are called integral proteins. So these are the types of the proteins that are found in the cell membrane. But the amount of these proteins as well as their type is vary from one cell to another. So like for example here we say in the myelin cells, 25% of the myelin cells is having actually protein internal membranes. And then for the mitochondria, it has 50% proteins. So these proteins of the plasma membrane are of two types. So you can, the other name for actually these integral proteins and peripheral proteins, it can be ectoproteins and endoproteins. So endoproteins are the integral proteins and the ectoproteins are the peripheral proteins. So these are the types of the proteins that are found in the cell membrane. And this plasma membranes also contain structural proteins. It contains structural proteins. It also contains transport proteins and enzymes. And some of them act as a receptor. So what is a receptor, ladies and gentlemen? I think you need to understand this very well. So in every situation when you have, like for example, if you take a drugs, you need a receptor that will bind to that drugs before it actually elicit its pharmacological activity. Like for example, let me just give you an example with insulin. We know that generally our, let's say this is a cell, let's say this is a cell, example, let's say this is the let's say this is a liver cell. This is a liver cell. So in this liver cell, you want to actually, this liver cell is actually want to get insulin. It want to get insulin into the cell. So this insulin must actually pass through the membrane of the cell before it gets into this cell. But this insulin cannot just get into this cell membrane, but it needs to be actually recognized, because one of the functions of the cell membrane is actually carried out what you call selective permeability. That is, it allows some materials to get into the cell and this allows some materials to get into the cell. So insulin need a receptor. It need a receptor, and that receptor is like a molecule that usually found on the surface of the cell, that first recognizes whether it is the insulin itself or whether it is other substances, whether it is unwanted substances. That insulin must first be recognized. So what recognize those kinds of molecules on the surface of the cell is what you call receptor. So some of these proteins that are found on the surface of the cells, they act as a receptors. So they are receptors because they are the one that actually recognize the molecules that is actually willing to get into the cell. So receptors are molecules, usually proteins that use in cellular recognition as well as a cellular transportation. So it first recognizes, is it insulin or is it a glucagon? Is it a neurotransmitter? For example, in a liver cell don't need neurotransmitter. So if neurotransmitter is actually come in contact with the liver cells will not allow it to get into. And let me just give you another example of receptor. Remember, in the case of coronavirus, some people are coming off or are coming down with coronavirus, while some people are not. And some cells are infected with coronavirus, while some cells are not infected with coronavirus. So why is it that the coronavirus must only affect humans? Why not rats? Why not cats? Why not dogs? Why not donkeys? Why not monkeys? Is because in the surface of our lung cell, on the surface of our lung cell, we have what we call angiotensin converting enzymes receptor 1. We have angiotensin converting enzyme receptor 1. That is why our lung cell can recognize that coronavirus, bind to it, attach to it, and allow it to get into the lung cell. And that is how we come up with coronavirus. So that is receptor. So some of these proteins that are found on the cell membrane, they act as a receptor. So ladies and gentlemen, before I leave this page, let me actually recap. There are proteins that are found in the cell membrane. And these proteins can either be integral protein or peripheral protein. What are integral proteins? Integral proteins are those proteins that are fully embedded into the cell membrane, while peripheral proteins are those proteins that partially touch themselves on the surface, on the cell membrane. That is one. And some of these proteins that are found in the cell membrane, they have structural function, they have transport function, and some of them are enzymes. Okay? So, what are the enzymes that are found on the cell membrane? What are those enzymes that are found in the cell membrane? Example of those enzymes, we have acetyl phosphatase, we have acid phosphatase, we have ATPase, we have RNase, we have maltase, we have phospholipases. So all these are the examples of the enzymes that are found on the surface of the cell membrane. So you should get this. And each of these cells have their own function. Each of these enzymes have their own function. Like for example, if we take ATPase, it's an enzyme that actually used in the degradation of ATP that is needed for the cell to function. So, but that is not what we are after. The most important thing is to understand what are the composition, what and what do we find in this cell membrane or on this cell membrane. So as we said, number one, we have lipids. And what are the lipids that are found? We have phospholipid, sphingolipid, glycolipid, and sterols. And then there is proteins, and these proteins, we have what we call integral protein and peripheral proteins, and the number and the type of the cell that are found, so the number and the types of the proteins that are found on the cell membrane varies. It depends on the types of the cell. And then the next thing that found on the surface or on the cell membrane is carbohydrate. So they are present in the plasma membrane and are present exterior, that is glycoproteins. So most of the proteins that are found on the cell membrane, they are formed of a conjugated form. When we said conjugated compound, conjugated, the word conjugated meaning that it's not only, or it is in combined with other molecules. Like for example, when we said glycoproteins, it means that it's a conjugate of glyco, sugar, that is sugar, and proteins. So you have sugar and proteins, or polar end of phospholipid at the external surface of plasma membrane. So ladies and gentlemen, what I want you to understand here is the types of the carbohydrate that are found in the cell membrane. It is either in the form of glycoproteins or is found as a sugar or as a polar head that attach itself to the phospholipids. So this is actually the form we have. This is usually the form of carbohydrate that are found in the cell membrane, either in the form of glycoproteins or as a polar end of phospholipid. When we said polar end, meaning that the component of the lipid that can interact with water. Remember from basic chemistry, when we said polar, it means that those molecules that can interact with water, and non-polar, it means that there are those molecules that cannot interact with water. And in the other way, we call polar, in the other way, polar is also named as, is the same thing to say hydrophilic. It means that philic, love, hydrophilic, it means the like water. Then non-polar means hydrophobic. So from phobia, the head water. So some of these carbohydrates are found on the surface of phospholipids that make it to interact with water, or that make the cell membrane interact with polar molecules. Okay? And then apart from carbohydrate, what other components do we have in the cell membrane? So that is called, so we are now going to look at the phospholipid. What is phospholipid? So phospholipid is a lipid that has both polar heads and non-polar tails. It means that the polar component of phospholipid is in form of heads that interact with water, while the other component of this phospholipid, it is non-polar. It is in a form of tail. It looks like something like this. It is something like this. You see, this is the head and this is the tail. So it has both polar and non-polar. So the non-polar component is the tail, while the polar component is the head. So the polar head is charged and hydrophilic. facing outward contain phosphate group and glycerol. So you see, first we started that this phospholipid is made up of number one, polar head and non-polar tails. So what is present? What do we get, or what and what do we have in the polar heads? So in that polar head, we have phosphate group and glycerol. And then the next thing is the non-polar. So what do we have in the non-polar tails? So the non-polar tails are hydrophobic. It means that the hates water. So it is facing inward. It is facing inward, and it contains two fatty acid chain that are non-polar. So you see, in the polar heads, there is phosphate group and glycerol. And then in the non-polar heads, there are two fatty acids that are non-polar. So when now you actually place phospholipid in water, it forms what you call a spherical bilayer. It forms what you call a spherical bilayer when you place phospholipids in water. And now we are going to see how this spherical form bilayer looks like. Okay? So now, this is the phospholipids. Look at it. From here, you can see this is what you call the polar head. This is the polar head. And if you look at it critically, you will now see that in this polar head, there is phosphate group. You see this, there is a phosphate group. This is the phosphate group. And there is also a main group. So this is what you call phospholipid, and it is found outside. Remember, I told you it's something like this. This is how the shape, and this is the tail. And this tail is the non-polar component. And this one is the polar component. And I told you in the polar component, we have glycerol and phosphate group. And in the tail, we have fatty acids. These are the fatty acids are found. So this is how the structure of the phospholipid looks like. It has hydrophobic heads and it has hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tail. Okay. So now the next thing that we are going to look at is the cholesterol. So we have cholesterol. So the amount of cholesterol might vary also with the type of the membrane. So it's depends on the type of the membrane. So membrane have high percentage or high content of this cholesterol, while some have lower. So the plasma membrane have nearly 1 cholesterol per phospholipid head. So it means that in each and every one phospholipid head, there is a likelihood, or in each and every phospholipid molecule, so there is a likelihood that you will have only 1 cholesterol. So get this right. So that is why now if you look at it, look at the structure very well. You can clearly see that from this structure we have, look at it. You can clearly see that this one is a phospholipid. This one is phospholipid. This one is phospholipid. So you see, you have 1 cholesterol here, you have 1 cholesterol here, you have 1 cholesterol. So it means that in each and every 1 molecule of phospholipid, there is a likelihood that you are going to get only 1 molecule of cholesterol. So now, the next thing that we are going to look at is the proteins are the critical to membrane function. So the proteins that are found on this cell membrane, they are critical and they are very, very important for the functions of the cell membrane, of the cell membrane. So remember that actually from the class that we did in the morning, I told you that the membrane have several functions, and number one, it has structural supports. It has structural support. Like for example, if you look at this, you can clearly see that this proteins that is here, it provides the structural support to the whole of the cell membrane. And second, it has recognition function. It can easily, it's used in the recognition. So you see, if you can now clearly see this is a molecule and this is a molecule or ligand and this is the integral protein. And I think clearly you can see that by looking at this one is a peripheral protein because it's partially attached to the cell membrane, and this one is integral protein because it is fully actually embedded into the cell membrane. So this is integral proteins. So in the case of this recognition, usually in the cell membrane, there are proteins, and these proteins, they are important in the recognition. It helps to recognize which molecules is actually trying to get into the cell and which molecules is getting out of the cell. So that functions is actually depend on the types of the protein that are found on the cell membrane, and then communication. For example, if like for example, let's say in a liver cells you have, let's say 100 cells or 1000 cells. So let's say cell 1 is infected with a virus, let's say HIV virus, that is retrovirus. That cell is infected with the retrovirus. So how cells actually tell the other cells that I am now infected with a particular virus and that virus is a problematic. What do I do? So it's these proteins. So generally, cells, when they are infected with some microorganisms that are not needed, or when they're infected, or when there is a problem with that particular cell, it needs to send a message or signals to the nearby cell so that at least they should prefer themselves against the incoming of that particular molecules. But sometimes if a particular cell is now infected with some microorganisms, what that cell does is first they will tell the nearby cells that okay, there is this kind of microorganisms, or there is this kind of danger, and I don't want this danger to affect you. So that is why I inform you that there is a problem. So that cell can either try as much as it can to protect itself, or to reverse the problem that is caused by that organisms. Or if it cannot actually reverse the situation, then the cell will die either through apoptosis or necrosis. And if that happened, then the other nearby cells are already being communicated by the molecules, and these are the molecules, look at them. These are the molecules that are secreted by the membrane through these proteins. So they will tell those proteins that okay, there is a problem, and let's try as much as possible to provide a defense system that will protect us. So cell membrane, it has one, structural support, recognition, and cellular communication. So remember, you all know that okay, there is a cellular communication, but you don't know how one cell communicates with one another. So usually cells are communicating with one another through the proteins that are found on the surface of that cell membrane. And then the last thing is the transport. You see, the proteins that are found in the cell membrane, they are important in transporting of substances in and out of that cell. So ladies and gentlemen, I think there is a problem with my Zoom, so it will stop in the